In the vast savannas of West Africa, a shadow spreads, one that moves faster than governments can respond and cuts deeper than borders can contain. Once known for its music, gold, and resilience, this region has now become the world's newest front line in the war on terror. From Mali to Niger, from Burkina Faso to Nigeria, extremist violence has transformed entire communities into battlefields. But how did this happen? How did the heart of Africa, once a symbol of hope and independence, become a terror hotspot? The answer lies not in a single battle, but in decades of neglect, injustice, and global games played on African soil. To understand why West Africa became a haven for terrorism, we must begin not with guns or ideology, but with geography and history. The Sahel, a belt of land stretching across the continent, just below the Sahara, is both a crossroads and a barrier. For centuries, caravans crossed these lands, trading gold, salt, and culture between the Mediterranean and sub-Saharan Africa. It was here that great empires once rose, Mali, Songhai, Ghana. But when colonial borders carved the continent, those natural connections were broken. Lines drawn in Paris and London divided tribes, languages, and trade routes. By the time independence came in the mid-20th century, the region inherited borders that made little sense, economies designed for extraction, and governments that struggled to serve their people. The result was fragile states, dependent on foreign aid and vulnerable to manipulation. For decades, instability simmered beneath the surface, droughts, corruption, coups, and poverty. But the explosion came much later, when global jihad met local despair. The modern wave of terrorism in West Africa traces its roots to the early 2000s. At that time, the world's attention was on Afghanistan and Iraq. But as extremist networks were pushed out of the Middle East, they began to seek new footholds. The Sahara, with its vast ungoverned spaces, weak states, and smuggling routes, became an ideal refuge. In 2011, NATO's intervention in Libya toppled Muammar Gaddafi. His regime collapsed, and with it, the control he had exerted over the desert routes that connected North and West Africa. Thousands of fighters, Tuareg mercenaries armed with weapons looted from Gaddafi's arsenals, returned to Mali and Niger. What followed was a chain reaction that no one could contain. In Mali, Tuareg rebels launched an uprising in 2012, declaring an independent state in the north called Azawad. But soon, their rebellion was hijacked by jihadist groups: Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, Ansar Dine, and the Movement for Unity and Jihad in West Africa, MUJAO. These groups quickly turned on their former allies, imposing harsh rule in cities like Timbuktu and Gao. The Malian army, under-equipped and demoralized, collapsed. France intervened in 2013 with Operation Serval, pushing back the insurgents. But the victory was temporary. Like water in the desert, the militants simply flowed south and east into Niger, Burkina Faso, and beyond. By the mid-2010s, the Sahel had become one of the most dangerous regions on Earth. Attacks multiplied on soldiers, on civilians, on schools, on churches and mosques alike. Villages were burned and markets destroyed. What began as isolated insurgencies evolved into coordinated regional terror networks. In Burkina Faso, a nation once known for its stability, violence exploded after 2015. Islamist groups infiltrated from Mali, exploiting local grievances. Young men, frustrated by unemployment, corruption, and marginalization, were easy recruits. In Niger, similar dynamics took hold, particularly along its porous borders. And in Nigeria, the deadly rise of Boko Haram had already devastated the country's northeast. Boko Haram's story is central to this wider crisis. Founded in the early 2000s by Mohammed Yusuf in Maiduguri, its name roughly translates to "Western education is forbidden." What began as a radical religious movement soon morphed into a full-blown insurgency after Yusuf's death in police custody in 2009. Under Abubakar Shekau, Boko Haram unleashed terror on an unimaginable scale, massacring civilians, abducting schoolgirls, and declaring allegiance to ISIS. The Nigerian army fought back, But corruption, desertion, and weak governance limited its effectiveness. As Boko Haram splintered, one faction aligned itself formally with the Islamic State, creating ISWAP, Islamic State West Africa Province. Today, ISWAP remains one of the most powerful terror organizations on the continent. What makes the Sahel's terrorism crisis so complex is that it's not just about religion. It's about survival. In rural areas where the state is absent and poverty is deep, extremist groups offer something governments have failed to provide: security, income, and a sense of belonging. Many recruits are not driven by ideology but by necessity. When governments neglect their people, when schools are closed and fields dry up, joining a militant group becomes a way to eat, to gain protection, or to take revenge against corrupt officials and abusive soldiers. The Sahel's terrorists thrive where justice fails. For decades, the nomadic Fulani people who herd cattle across borders have faced discrimination and clashes with settled farmers. Militants have exploited these tensions, framing them as ethnic or religious wars. Entire communities have been drawn into cycles of revenge that have little to do with Islam, but everything to do with desperation. And then there's the role of foreign powers. France, the former colonial ruler of much of the region, has maintained a heavy military presence through operations like Barkhane. The United States has bases for drone surveillance. The European Union funds local armies and security forces. Yet despite billions in aid and military support, terrorism has spread, not shrunk. Why? Because bombs cannot fix broken systems. In many Sahelian countries, the real enemy is not just terrorism, it is governance failure. Corruption siphons off aid money meant for schools and roads. Soldiers go unpaid while politicians buy luxury homes abroad. Courts are weak, elections rigged, and young people lose faith in democracy. When people no longer believe their governments represent them, they turn to whoever promises change, even if that change comes at the barrel of a gun. By 2020, frustration had reached a boiling point. Coups swept through the region: Mali in 2020 and 2021, Burkina Faso in 2022, Niger in 2023. In each case, the military justified its takeover by citing the government's failure to protect citizens from terrorists. Crowds cheered, waving national flags and denouncing Western interference. But coups are no cure. In many cases, they simply replace one failing elite with another. And yet, they reflect a deep truth: that the people of the Sahel feel abandoned, both by their leaders and by the international community. At the same time, global forces have further complicated the picture. As Western militaries scale down their presence, new players have moved in. Russia, through its private military contractors like the Wagner Group, has built alliances with Sahelian regimes. In exchange for protection and arms, these regimes offer mining rights and political loyalty. Meanwhile, extremist groups exploit every vacuum. When France withdrew troops from Mali in 2022, attacks surged again. The militants, more mobile and better armed than ever, now operate freely across borders, from Mauritania to Chad. The cost of this endless war is staggering. According to the United Nations, more than 6,000 people were killed in Burkina Faso alone in 2023, and millions have been displaced across the Sahel. Entire regions are cut off, with humanitarian aid unable to reach those in need. Children grow up knowing only fear, their schools turned into ruins. Yet, amidst the devastation, there are glimmers of resilience. In local communities, people have formed their own defense groups, not as militias of vengeance, but as protectors of life. Women have become mediators in peace talks. Youth organizations are using social media to counter extremist narratives. Civil society, often silenced by politics, is beginning to speak again. Religious leaders preach tolerance instead of hate. And slowly, a new understanding emerges: that the war against terror cannot be won by armies alone. It must be fought with justice, jobs, and dignity. Education is perhaps the most powerful weapon in this battle. Where schools open, ideology fades. Where governments invest in health, agriculture, and youth, extremism finds no ground to grow. The future of West Africa depends not on how many terrorists are killed, but on how many citizens are empowered to live free from fear. The world must also learn to listen. For too long, external powers have treated the Sahel as a chessboard, a place to project influence, deploy troops, or secure resources. But real stability will come only when Africans define their own security, their own governance, their own destiny. Regional cooperation, through groups like ECOWAS and the African Union, remains key. Terrorism does not respect borders, so neither should peace efforts. Intelligence sharing, joint patrols, and coordinated development plans could do more than any single foreign intervention. And above all, the region needs hope that life can return to the villages where laughter once replaced gunfire, that roads can be rebuilt, and that the next generation can inherit not fear, but opportunity. The story of how West Africa became a terror hotspot is not just a chronicle of violence, it is a mirror. It reflects what happens when injustice festers, when the world forgets the peripheries, and when promises of democracy crumble into disillusionment. But the same story also holds the blueprint for recovery, because the opposite of terrorism is not only peace, it is trust. And if West Africa can rebuild that trust, between leaders and citizens, between neighbors and nations, then the Sahel may yet rise from its scars. In the end, the question is not only how West Africa became a terror hotspot, but whether the world will help it stop burning. As the sun sets over the dusty plains of the Sahel, a quiet tragedy unfolds each evening. Mothers call their children indoors before darkness falls, not because of bedtime, but because night brings danger. The hum of motorcycles in the distance might mean traders, or it might mean armed men. In towns once filled with laughter and song, silence has become survival. The war on terror in West Africa has entered its second decade, and its toll is immeasurable. Millions displaced, thousands missing, entire generations growing up knowing only fear. For many, home is no longer a place. It's a memory carried in exile. But this is not a story of despair alone. It's also a story of endurance, of how ordinary people keep going even when the world seems to have forgotten them. Across Burkina Faso, farmers who fled their land have formed small communities in camps on the outskirts of cities. They plant whatever seeds they can find, hoping that the rains will come and that soldiers will not. In Mali, teachers gather children under trees, continuing lessons despite no blackboards or books. In Niger, women's cooperatives weave cloth from scraps, selling them to feed their families. These small acts of defiance, of living when death surrounds, are what keep the Sahel alive. Yet, while the people struggle to survive, the political and military games continue above them. Governments change, alliances shift, and external powers reposition themselves, each claiming to bring stability, each often deepening the divisions they claim to solve. After France's withdrawal from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, a geopolitical vacuum emerged, one that new powers were eager to fill. Russia, through the Wagner Group and later its successor, Africa Corps, presented itself as a liberator from neo-colonial influence. Its soldiers appeared in propaganda videos alongside local troops, pledging to defend African sovereignty. But behind the slogans lay darker motives: access to gold mines, uranium, and political control. Meanwhile, China increased its quiet presence through infrastructure projects and trade. Turkey sold drones to Sahelian armies. The United States maintained intelligence bases, but scaled back direct involvement. Each actor claimed to be helping, but none truly addressed the roots of the crisis: governance, education, opportunity. The Sahel had become not only a terror hotspot, but a stage for global competition, a Cold War fought under the burning African sun. As this struggle for influence played out, the human cost continued to climb. Villages vanished from maps. Humanitarian convoys were ambushed. The lines between rebel and civilian blurred. Entire ethnic groups, Fulani, Tuareg, Mossi, were stigmatized, accused of aiding militants simply because of where they lived or how they looked. In many areas, revenge killings became routine. One attack by extremists would be followed by retaliatory raids by local militias, often backed by state forces. The spiral of violence deepened. Children orphaned by one massacre would grow up seeking vengeance in the next. Terror begets terror. And so the cycle spins endlessly. The United Nations calls it one of the fastest-growing displacement crises in the world. But statistics can't capture the ache of a grandmother who buries her son, or the silence of a school where no child remains. And yet, amid all this, another story unfolds, one less told, but just as real. It is the story of awakening. Across Africa, a new generation is beginning to question the narratives they inherited. They see the failures of their leaders and the manipulation of foreign powers. They understand that the answer cannot come from Paris or Washington or Moscow. It must come from within. In Bamako and Ouagadougou, young voices rise in protest. They demand accountability, not just slogans. In universities and digital forums, African students debate new paths, ideas of regional unity, self-reliance, and Pan-African cooperation. In this growing consciousness, there is power. Because the greatest threat to terrorism is not weapons. It is awareness. But to reach that awakening, the region must first confront hard truths. The Sahel's crisis is not merely a fight against jihadists. It is a mirror of decades of neglect, the failure to build nations that work for all their people. In many rural areas, the government exists only as a uniform that passes through once a month. When the state does appear, it's often in the form of soldiers, not teachers or doctors. Trust has been broken, and without trust, no peace will last. The first step toward rebuilding that trust is justice. Communities must see that crimes, whether by terrorists or by state forces, are punished. The second is inclusion, recognizing that ethnic and regional groups long treated as outsiders are part of the nation's fabric. And the third is opportunity. If young men and women can find dignity in work, if they can dream of a future better than their present, no extremist ideology will lure them. Beyond the Sahel's borders, the consequences of this conflict ripple outward. West Africa's coastal nations, Ghana, Togo, Benin, Côte d'Ivoire, once seen as safe, now face growing incursions. Terror cells have moved southward, attacking police posts and villages near the borders. If the Sahel burns unchecked, the fire may soon reach the Atlantic. The refugee flows are already immense. Camps in Chad and Mauritania overflow. Many risk their lives crossing the Mediterranean, fleeing not just poverty but war. Europe debates how to stop migration, yet rarely asks what drives it. The truth is simple. People don't leave home unless home becomes unlivable. Every bullet fired in the Sahel echoes across continents, in migration policy, in global security, in human conscience. The irony is painful. The region that was once the cradle of ancient civilizations, the land of Mansa Musa's wealth, of Timbuktu's libraries and scholars, is now branded a terror zone. But the Sahel's history runs deeper than its wounds. Long before colonizers drew maps, these lands were interconnected through trade, faith, and kinship. Merchants from Gao traded with craftsmen from Kano. Scholars from Timbuktu corresponded with Cairo. The Sahel's future may lie in rediscovering those old connections, not as nostalgia, but as a roadmap. Regional cooperation through joint patrols, shared intelligence, and economic partnerships offers a way forward. But it will require trust, transparency, and above all leadership that serves people, not power. Some signs of change have begun to appear. In 2024, the Alliance of Sahel States, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, declared their intent to coordinate defense and development efforts independent of Western control. Their rhetoric of sovereignty struck a chord with populations tired of dependency. But true sovereignty will not come through isolation. It will come through responsibility, through building schools, empowering women, and restoring the rule of law. The Sahel doesn't need saviors. It needs systems that work. Religion, so often used as a weapon, can also be a bridge. Many imams and priests have joined efforts to counter radical narratives, promoting coexistence and forgiveness. In communities torn by conflict, they are the voices calling for restraint, reminding people that faith should heal, not divide, across the region. Grassroots peace builders, local elders, women's groups, youth associations are mediating truces, opening dialogues, and rebuilding trust where politicians have failed. These unsung heroes rarely make headlines, but they hold the fragile threads of peace together. If the world wants to help, it should begin by listening to them. The international community faces a choice. It can continue treating West Africa as a security problem, sending troops, drones, and reports, or it can recognize it as a human crisis demanding investment, empathy, and partnership. For every million spent on weapons, a fraction could build schools, fund vocational programs, or provide clean water. Those would do more to defeat terrorism than any bomb ever could, because terror does not grow in faith, it grows in famine. It grows where hope dies. As the 2030s approach, the question is no longer whether West Africa will overcome terrorism, but how it will choose to do so, through fear or through transformation, through foreign intervention or through collective strength. The young generation, connected by phones, music, and a shared hunger for dignity, may be the one to end the cycle. They do not carry the same colonial scars, but they inherit their consequences. And perhaps that is why they are beginning to imagine something new, an Africa that defines itself not by crisis, but by possibility. In a dusty classroom in northern Burkina Faso, a teacher once told his students, "Our land is dry, but our hearts are not. If the rain forgets us, we will call it back." Those words, whispered in a war zone, capture the essence of the Sahel struggle and its spirit. Because beneath the statistics and the sorrow, there remains something unbreakable, the will to endure, to rebuild, to reclaim. The story of how West Africa became a terror hotspot is tragic, but it is not final. The same forces that tore it apart, injustice, neglect, foreign manipulation, can be reversed through unity, equity, and purpose. And when that happens, when the world no longer looks at this region through the lens of fear, but of admiration, the Sahel will remind us all of what it has always been, the bomb, beating heart of Africa's resilience, the wind that carries dust across the Sahara will someday carry stories of rebirth, stories of children returning to reopened schools, of markets buzzing again, of soldiers laying down arms to plant crops, because even in the hottest desert, life finds a way, and so will West Africa.